What's up, guys? Welcome to the podcast where we can listen to trans and gender non binary voices telling us their story in their voice, reminding us that each of us is not alone. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Not Alone. I'm here with Kato again. Kato Lujan Camacho. Kato has been with us before. Kato is someone who has a different journey from many of the other journeys we've talked about, which is why I think that journey is so interesting, so exciting. But before I continue, I'm going to let Kato actually tell us more about himself. So, Kato, all you.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I am Kato Lujan Camacho. My pronouns are he and him. I'm an independent consultant, creator, and trans man showing up in the space. Really excited to be here because yeah, last time we were here, we got talking about some bigger concepts around being trans. So it's really exciting to actually get into, as you said, that little bit different side of things. Because yeah, my story is a little bit atypical when it comes to being a trans man. So I'm really excited to talk about that today.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for doing this. So let's talk a little bit about that. So, number one, you actually talked about the fact that your pronouns are he, him. My first question for you, and I really don't want to get into the whole broader conversation, but here's the broader conversation. A lot of people put that he him onto their descriptors on the screen. You chose not to. Why is that?
For me, it comes down to the fact that I have a very long name, and usually it gets clipped off. It's choosing. It's a big thing for me. My full name is really an affirmation of another element of my identity, which is my indigenous identity. So it's a constant balancing act, and it really has nothing to do with not choosing to put them in there. It's more like if I put them in here, something's going to have to get cut off. So I always advise people, if you have the capacity, put your pronouns in there if you can. And yeah, for this one, since we're already talking about trans identity, I chose not to, but otherwise you will very rarely see me out there without them in the description.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the clarity. The other reason I've actually seen done is some people have taken the position that I don't want to have that discussion, which is odd in this context because we are literally having that discussion. But the other one is also the fact that sometimes they just think that it's just an uncomfortable conversation to go down. But I wanted to bring it around and say that different people have different views, and someone who's living their life, their identity, can still choose to not do that, and that's still a personal choice. And I thought that was the reason I chose to highlight it. But it also brings us to the second point, which is your pronouns are he, him, but they've not always been the case. So I want to talk about that beginning, um, where you have told me that you use she, her pronouns, and you were comfortable with the she, her pronouns at that point. So let's talk about the journey of how Kato came to be. So tell me a little bit about your original sort of when you realized who you are, in terms of just your earliest childhood memory and who you were then and how that connected to everything else.
Yeah. I have not yet met a trans person who hasn't had a life full of coming out, and mine's been the same, but in a different way because we talked about this briefly on last time we got together, but I didn't start using terms like transgender or queer or anything else like that to really describe myself until my later 20s. What I did ID as very early on in my life is I knew that my sexuality was not straight up heterosexual. I had a variety of different relationships with different people of different gender expressions, and that is how I first actually encountered trans people, was not IDing as one, but being in relationships with trans people. I
Hmm.
dated trans men and trans women throughout my life, and that allowed me to start differentiating between gender and sexuality, because the common narrative in our culture is that gender and sexuality is one. Whatever you are assigned at birth, you're attracted to the opposite. And that's just you don't got to ask any questions about it. And so coming into that, from the time that I started to have romantic relationships up until my adulthood, I knew that there was more fluidity to it. And I knew that there was more possibility for expression and affirmation than just, okay, I'm a cisgender woman and I date men. It's like, no, I know
Well,
that there's more to that.
I want to. We definitely want to get here, right? Because it's such an interesting conversation of the evolution of gender and sexuality. But before we get there, I want to talk about. Let's give previous you a your dead name, if you will. Do you have a preferred dead name, if you will? Is that you'd like to
We can
use?
just use my name right now, and that's something that we talked about briefly as well
Yeah,
before. I'm very comfortable talking about having ID'd as a cisgender woman, all of that.
sure.
I also know that there's a lot of power in our dead names, and so
Yeah.
putting those out there, it's just one of those things that doesn't add any value to the conversation beyond what we're already doing. So just for
Oh,
the folks out there
100%.
listening, yeah.
100%. I should have clarified. I didn't phrase that properly. You had exactly expressed that, which is why I was trying to say, should we use, I'm making up a name, Diana, to refer to your past? Because Kato is such a masculine name, and I wanted to give deference to that as well. But the past, I'm trying to identify Kato as a young woman as in her past, in her early stages. Talk to me about that life. Where did you grow up? Who did you grow up as?
Yeah. So I grew up here in Washington State,
Okay.
in between the extremely urban and the extremely rural. Spent a majority of my life within about an hour's drive of Mount Rainier. So it was kind of that almost idyllic kind of rural life. So it was me, my parents, and various different family members. Being Islander, there's always somebody else in the house. There's like I think anybody of any different background knows that the house is always full of people. So I had a lot of family around me growing up, um, and so there was always that community element throughout my experience there. And IDing as a first a girl and then a woman, I always had a bunch of really incredible female role models around me. My great grandparents, my grandparents, my mother, and so I saw women in different roles, as entrepreneurs, as managers of homes, doing different things, and that maybe contributed to at that time feeling so much comfort within my gender identity because I didn't see women restricted to a lot of historically feminine roles. The women in my life really kind of did it all and did it great. So
That's such a wonderful concept. So you didn't grow up in what some might call a conservative childhood, if you will. You grew up in a open childhood that expressed and reviewed. Reviewed such a terrible word, but that saw you in an expansive view. So what was that like in school? When was the first time you discovered that you weren't hetero?
I can perfectly remember it. It was my best childhood friend. She was like, we just were the best buddies over at each other's house, everything like that, all the time. That core memory of like, oh my gosh, this is my best friend. I want to spend my rest of my life around this person. I remember I had a dream where we were getting married, and I just remember being like, well, that's weird because I've never looked at her and thought that she was attractive or anything else like that. But it was that little bit of moment there where I went, I am allowed to think about someone who at the time is the same gender as me in that capacity. And that allowed me to kind of start going, okay, let's think a little bit more expansively here. And so I dated a cisgender woman in high school, or girl at that time, since,
Can I stop you for a second?
yeah.
So this best friend, what age were you at when this was
Oh,
happening?
probably like 11, 12. Just that age where it's like I have the vision of, I know a wedding means everybody's dressed up really nice and we're walking through a church, and I have no idea anything else about it.
Okay.
It's just this really beautiful, innocent core idea of, mm, I'm dreaming I'm getting married to my friend because I just love them so much. And
So was this puberty yet, or is this
I
before
probably
puberty?
just the start of it. I remember puberty as coming home, telling my mom, I got my period, and then her calling all of our female relatives, and so that instant trauma right off the gate. But it probably right around that time, and so I don't recall having any thoughts like that or anything prior to that. And even talking back with my mom, she's like, "You didn't read as queer as a kid necessarily, but it was those kind of things that at no point did I really articulate them openly, because not because I felt ashamed of anything, but because it just felt like, oh yeah, okay. Of course I would feel that way. I like this person.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's explore pre age 11, because I'm just curious and this is always fun to me. What was the first time you actually met someone who was queer or knew about someone who was queer?
Yeah, that was my first boyfriend in high school.
Okay.
We
Okay.
all find each other, and so
Sure.
there was a boy that I dated at the time, and we were just best buds. And then eventually, as high school relationships do, you date for a week and then you break up.
Yeah.
And then he started dating a boy, and I went, "Oh, okay, that makes sense. You seem a lot happier now." So that was that first instance of really acknowledging, okay, there are queer people around me.
Okay.
I don't recall having any trans people at our school, but we had plenty of gay and lesbian folks, people who were androgynous, all of these different queer identities. And at least for me then, it was just a matter of fact thing, despite growing up in the era where we used gay as a pejorative. We would say, that's so gay, things like, and I remember saying that and now cringing, going like, what does that mean? What are you
Right.
saying?
Right.
But I did see queer people all around me, starting at that junior high, high school level. And it was, thankfully, I mean, obviously I can't step into their shoes, but thankfully they were people who I saw moving through school and getting to exist normally. It didn't, I didn't see as much overt bullying, but again, that might just be the fact that at that point I was still outside of it to that
Wow.
degree.
Um, so what I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to identify sort of the birth of Kato, if you will. So I'm trying.
It's
Uh,
years later, so
oh,
much later.
I recognize that, but I'm talking about the birth of Kato as a queer identity, and what that might look like, because obviously Kato came about in your mid to late 20s, like you said. But what and what you've described your family to be a very loving, um, sort of not traditional, but welcoming family. Um, so it's not like being gay or being queer would have been disapproved of in any way. Um, but did you watch, for example, a lot of women I know, maybe it's of my generation, will go, Buffy was the series that made me go, that sounds or feels a little bit like me. Or you'll have someone go, I really always was androgynous, or whatever it was like, and I just didn't know. Yes, you had your gay boyfriend, and well, that's not fair. Your boyfriend turned out to be gay, if you will, and you discovered an interest in your best friend. But did you have anything before that, like a crush or anything like that, or not so much?
It's really, this is a conversation very close to conversations I've had with tons of folks that, no,
No.
I had
Okay.
some hobbies that were slightly more boyish, but I was never a tomboy.
Okay.
I liked all the same things that my female friends liked, and
Okay.
I hung out with everybody. And really, for up until I was out on my own, living independently, everything else, it was never something that either I defined myself by or anyone else defined me by. And it was never something that came up in any way that I really look back on with significance. I never
Yeah.
came out at any point to my parents. It just was always normal. And there's really nothing that I look back on those early years, like 0 to 18, and go, oh, yeah, that's where it starts. And it's strange because I really have not met many other trans folks like that. People can go like, oh, I can piece the dots, together. But
Yeah.
looking back, they're really, for me,
Yeah.
there weren't any signs at that age just yet that any of this would be the life that I have now.
I think that's amazing. I think that the fact that you've lived these two distinct lives is what makes this fascinating. So there was really nothing. Age 11, age 12, you sort of had this, and I'm visualizing you wearing dresses, enjoying them, all that good stuff. Age 11, age 12, you had this concept of, oh, my best friend's. I want to be with my best friend. I don't know what the word "be" means, but I want to be with her. Um, your ex boyfriend comes out as gay. Well, I say gay, but queer, could have been bi for all we know. Um, and then you said you started dating individuals with different identities. Uh, Talk to me a little bit about that. How did you discover what you were interested in, who you were interested in, all that good stuff?
Yeah. So I left home at like 15, 16, and I started living independently very early on. And I moved to Seattle, Washington. And so 18 to 21, 22, there was this period of time where I was finally kind of getting my feet underneath me, living independently. And if anybody's ever been to Seattle, Washington, they know of Capitol Hill. It's like our gay neighborhood. And I was living there. And I was on, I think, OK Cupid. This is pre Tinder, I think, or pre Tinder really taking off. And I had my settings set to show me everybody of all genders. And someone came along using she they pronouns. I still remember they had bald head, and she had these really like striking, almost 80s era kind of makeup. It was really, now I look and I'm like, oh, that's so queer. It's so out there and it's so in your face. And I was just instantly enthralled by this person. And so I matched and we started having these talks back and forth. And the relationship never really went anywhere. But it was my first time being with someone who, prior to that, I would have said, oh, this is a really feminine man. But now having to go, okay, let me look at this person and look further into what they are telling me they are and internalizing that. And after that, the idea of running into these people who are, non-binary, who are trans, who have a different gender expression became kind of inconsequential. And I went on to date people who were binary trans individuals, non-binary queer folks, dating, you mentioned, bisexual men and bisexual women and all these different folks of these different identities and expressions, and still was not identifying. I'm just like, yeah, I just happen to date these people. It has nothing to do with me. Looking back and thinking it's like, okay, maybe there was some things here, but in those relationships, I was still she, her pronouns. I'm still a very high femme and very comfortable within that. And I, want to be treated in the relationship as that. And those are still situations where I'm differentiating gender and sexuality, but I'm still not reflecting as much on what gender means for me.
So, so you said around this was around the age of 18 when you started
Early
dating
20s, yeah, like late
early
teens, early
20s.
20s, yeah.
So did you date cis women before that?
Yeah, one or two. You know, throughout I will openly admit I was definitely a bit of a serial dater from my late teens to mid 20s. And so, yeah, occasionally. And it was always relationships that were really fun and comfortable, but I never identified with the term lesbian. And to the point where I had really, really bad luck when it came to having dates with people who identified as lesbian because they were like, "You're not a lesbian." And I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who isn't going to have long term aspirations of being with a woman. You know, it's always a one off relationship or short term dating or something. But I encountered a lot of lesbian women who were like, "You are, this is a fling or this is a fun thing for you. This is not a long term thing." And I couldn't identify it then. So they were seeing something that I wasn't.
Um, so let's explore that period, if you will. Would you identify as and this is for those people who are listening, and I apologize for getting really into identities and stuff like that, but would you identify as heteroromantic, or would you identify as fluid, if you will?
Yeah, even even terms like bi or pan, I think attach too much significance to it. It was really just a, if I see someone and they are interesting to me or I find them beautiful. Maybe I'm looking at them because they are the opposite of my expression. Maybe it's because they're mirroring me. I went on a date with one woman because her earrings were really interesting. It's, the standards are all over the place, but
Sure.
it's one of those things where I didn't attach any language to it, and every time I tried to, it felt very false
Mm.
because that element of my life, as I mentioned earlier, there was no attachment of significance to it. It's just, this is a fact that people of all different expressions can be attractive to me. And I can find value in people of all different expressions. And I didn't have any desire to quantify it in any way. So I definitely have described myself using, like, oh, I'm pansexual, I'm bisexual, and these things throughout my life. But it has always been a way of helping other people conceptualize me and not me conceptualize what I actually am.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, the reason that I asked the question I did is I'm thinking of these women um, who looked at you and said, "You, to you, this is a fling. This is not a long-term relationship." I'm assuming that they are right. I have no idea because I don't know what your current status is. So I'm sort of assuming. Let's assume they're right for a second. Does that mean that you were happy to be with them and you were attracted to them, but you did not see yourself having a lifelong relationship with them? Or did that mean that they were wrong and you were open to a long term relationship with anyone who was interesting to you?
It's hard to say
Okay.
because obviously I never ended up having long term relationships with them. But in my mind, I remember going like, well, you don't know that. This could be a long term thing. It could be. Um, what I think more than anything was not that they were 100% right or I was 100% wrong. It was more that I think, specifically within the lesbian community, there has been a lot of trivialization of the lesbian identity. They like, oh, women can have flings with other women and it's not a big deal. So at least a lot of my lesbian friends are conditioned to, I know when a straight girl's coming around just to experiment a little bit and then I'm going to get left in the dirt.
Okay.
And I think that they acknowledged those elements of me of like, I'm out here not attaching significance, not engaging in lesbian culture, not doing these things that are hallmarks of this community. And in that, they I was operating as an other in that space,
Right.
even despite participating on the surface as like, oh, I'm having intimate relationships with women, but deeper than that, not engaging with the culture that comes along with that was definitely, I think, a red flag for some of these people who had seen this, this whole circus before.
This is the first time I'm having a conversation about this, so I have no idea what I'm talking about, just to be very, very clear. But I'm trying to expose, I feel like most decisions come down to a very binary, I choose to do it or I choose not to do it, and I'll go one way or the other. In your case, you kind of said, I choose to explore my sexuality. I choose to eventually explore my gender, my gender. Um, but do you, knowing your past in the lesbian community, were there decisions or certain, and hate to use terms like toxicity, but was there any kind of toxicity exposed, which is what makes some women trans exclusionary?
You know, at that point, I really that's a huge conversation, and one that in this case I don't think is necessarily aligned because
Okay.
at that point I was not exploring my gender. I was showing up in these spaces extremely feminine, wanting to be treated as such. I
Right.
was I ID'd as a woman. I'm using she her pronouns. I'm all of the trappings of femininity felt comfortable at that time. And
Okay.
so to have people ID me as, anything else would have felt very strange at that
Right.
time.
Right.
That if I was walking down the street, there would be absolutely no one who would assume I was anything other than a cisgender woman, myself included. So I do think that there is a lot of merit to be had of the conversation of transphobic spaces within the lesbian community and within the gay male community.
Sure.
At that point, I don't think it's something that was playing into it. More
Okay.
so that time, the people that I was dating and having relationships with, I understood that it mattered to them a lot that their sexuality be affirmed. The bisexual people that I'm having relationships with want affirmation that they are bisexual. The lesbians that I'm having relationships with want to be affirmed in their lesbianism. And I couldn't give that to people
Yeah.
because I wasn't bi, I wasn't lesbian, I wasn't pansexual. I just was me
Yeah.
going like, well, what looks good today? And that's something that's hard for I think a lot of people to navigate in relationships in general. When you
Yeah.
realize that you're putting a lot more significance into the situation than the other person. And I think that goes beyond relationships, sexuality, gender, or anything else.
Yeah. So you started, you had this one individual off of Okay Cupid, um, and this individual was interesting, um, and she identified with she her pronouns. Did that, and you then said you kind of dated everyone, but what you did describe is a repeated consistency in dating binary or non-binary trans individuals. Is that fair description of what you said?
I think when I say consistent, it's like every so often I would come across someone who ID'd as some kind of queer, and I would say, "Oh, sure, that's fine."
Yeah.
There was no intentionally seeking people out,
Okay.
and nor excluding people. It's hard to describe exactly how fluid that period of my life was from like 18 to about 23, maybe 22 was just a if I feel comfortable in this space, then
Yeah.
that's fine. And I think more often it was that the queer and trans people I met had put more effort into being approachable and being accessible and being comfortable spaces
Got it.
versus anything else.
Um, the reason I asked that question is that there's a whole other identity, as I'm sure you know, of being trixic, which is being attracted to trans individuals. And I didn't know if that was what you were experiencing, or that was just they were just ones that sort of grabbed your attention at that moment, which is what it was.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna we're as always, you're so interesting that we have literally gotten to your early 20s and we've run out of time. Um, I hope you'll consider coming again so we can explore the next part of this journey.
Of course. Yeah, no, this is there's definitely a lot to it, and I know that it's it can be a challenge to navigate with other folks because we're so invested in the concept of all of this, our gender, our sexuality, and everything else having so much significance and being so inexorably tied to our identity that I found a lot of queer and trans people who really take issue with the fact that I'm like, there's a big black line in my life, and before this, nothing. And it's really, it can be challenging, but it is one of those conversations that I think needs to be had, that people can be two very different things within their life, and those two things can not have anything to do with each other. And so it definitely warrants deeper diving, because we're right on the cusp there of where it all starts to come together. But
No, this was amazing. Again, Kato, thank you so much. Before we go, if people want to reach out to you and use your services, because you provide an independent service, so do you want to talk a little bit about what that is?
yeah, so I consider myself a catalytic consultant. We talked about this a little bit before that. Well, even just before the call, I was like, oh, I have my notes. I really pride myself on being able to take the energy that comes with the small business and entrepreneurial space, kind of that zealous chaos, and organizing it into actionable systems for people. So if folks want to learn more about my work, they can visit me at my full name, katoluancamacho.com, or look me up on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to spot. Give me an ad, send me a message, anything else, and I'm more than happy to talk to folks who are out here leading the work in the entrepreneurial space.
Thank you again for coming on, Kato.
Awesome. Thank you.